celebrate Black History Month. Today we have a special guest, and I will kindly ask Dean Mercado to introduce Herbert. They are good friends. Dean Mercado.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, everybody, for coming. So, Herbert has been working on this project for a long time. He's the Associate Director of the Institute for the Exploration of Seneca Village History. And in addition to that, he's a teacher and also Director of Academic Advising Office at the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership. Welcome, Herbert Seignoret.
We will just circulate and move around for you. As the guys mentioned, my name is Herbert Seignoret. I'm also the Director for Academic Advising and Colin School, but also I'm an alum of CCNY. So I came here many months ago to study architecture, took a couple classes in anthropology, and jumped ship from architecture to anthropology. But there's a story behind that you'll get to know as we go along. So, you all New Yorkers in some way all here because you live in New York right now. How many of you have the pleasure of walking through Central Park with your picnic baskets? Good, good, good. And when you go through Central Park, do you ever think of what might have been there prior to the park being built, or you just open your bottle of wine and enjoy it and you don't forget about the past, you just think about the present? You think you consider what might have been there prior? Yes. Okay, so we're going to explore this tonight. It's going to be two parts. One part, we're going to do some historical research where you are going to become historians and historical archaeologists. And the other part, I'm going to just show the process that we went through in what we did when we had a field school. So to get started, when we got Seneca Village, it was an area from about 82nd Street up to about 89th Street and the west side of the park. So just to give you an idea of where the settlement was located. Now, to get started, I'm going to ask anybody with a loud voice might want to read this paragraph from the New York Herald, August 11th, 1871. And that's from the collection of the New York Historical Society. Can I get a volunteer? Okay.
Yesterday afternoon, while laborers were engaged in uprooting trees at the new entrance to the Central Park, corner of 85th Street and 8th Avenue, they discovered 14 inches beneath the surface a black rosewood coffin, richly mounted and in a state of good preservation. On the lid was a plate with the engraving, Margaret McIntee, died February 1852, aged 16 years, 3 months and 14 days. Within the coffin was the body of a woman decayed almost to a skeleton. At a short distance from the spot, another coffin was found enclosing the body of a Negro, decomposed beyond recognition. This land was dug up 5 years ago when the trees were planted there, and no such coffins were there at the time.
I can take a minute and just think of what was read. Ask some questions to that paragraph. For example, why is one described in more detail? If somebody bought a body was discovered decomposed beyond recognition, how would they know the person might have been a Negro? Why is one name given and another name not given? What other questions might you come up with? Yes?
How can there be a 20-year gap between someone dying and their coffin not the time it goes?
So time doesn't make any sense. Anything else?
14 inches.
So 40, just because when normally if you bury it, it's a couple feet through, but this is just 40 inches. Any other questions?
A name and a Negro. A name versus Negro.
Okay. So pick up these questions and then maybe have a discussion with the person next to you for 2 minutes. What are some of the questions you have answered in your discussions? Yes.
In print, they mentioned two bodies. They may have made the decision because there were other bodies. No, neither body.
So let's explore. Any other questions and answers in any other groups? What would your group over here? What would you guys? Yes.
One conference is described in greater detail.
Which one?
The first one.
So if we see a name Margaret McKinsey, any assumptions we can make?
Irish.
So it's a Celtic name, so we assume she might be Irish, white possibly,
And
young.
And all the information is in great font.
So there's no need to include any ethnicity is assumed, whereas the other one is a need to give ethnicity because it's a process of othering. But in the process of othering, what happens? There's no name, right? There's no description. Why? Why? So this is something we're going to explore as we go along. Just get us warm and started up. Yes.
And it was just a few years after the draft riot, so there may have been some collective resentment. Oh, we discovered one of those.
Let's see.
There's probably still some resentment from the draft riot today, because Northerners are very quick to say, oh, you evil Southerners. But New York was the second, or I'm stealing your thunder.
We'll come back to that.
Yes.
Okay. So
I'll behave. For now.
For now. So I want to show you some population figures for New York City and give you a sense of what's happening in the early 19th century in New York City. So if you look at 1830, New York's population is about just under 200,000, but out of that, you have about 14,000, maybe close to 14,000 who are African American and 17,000 Irish. Let's jump over to 1845. Population is just under 400,000, but the percentage shifts. If you look at Irish, it's almost 100,000, whereas this is the Christian African Americans, it's still almost just about 12,000. Then if we go to when Seneca Village was no more, New York City's population is about 630,000, the Irish, close to 200,000, 175, African Americans, 11,800, so almost 12,000. Where are all these people coming from, and what's happening to the city? What does the city look like?
Yeah.
So this is an image of the 5 points. Have you guys heard of the 5 points?
Yeah.
What's happening down the 5 points?
Crime.
Gangs of New York.
Pardon?
Gangs of New York.
Gangs of New York. What else? What else?
Crime.
So
Ownership, small business ownership.
okay, so some people focus on something negative because that's what we are led to believe and what's published. But societies and communities are complex. When you describe some place as blighted, it might be blighted by this, the person who's describing it, but some people live in there, the experience is totally different. So, the image we have of the 5 points is sex, drugs, rock and roll, right? Back in the day, right? What are some of the things that stand out in that image?
Very high density.
High density, so there are a lot of folks, and it looks like there's a lot of rioting. What are the predominance in terms of businesses? What sort of businesses do you notice? Grocery stores, liquor stores. Look at the image of the person in the center of that painting. What sort of features do you see? And how is this person dressed? Does that person look like they live in that community, or they just pass in front trying to understand what's happening in that community? Look at the way the people who are African American and people who might be of a different class how they are depicted. So there's a lot of confusion. It looks like there's rioting, there's fighting, a lot of grog shops, there are brothels. So the city is growing, there's immigration, a lot of migrants in the city. Is that different from today? See the reaction. So those that be decided, wait a minute, we need to get out of that. That's just stuff of City Hall, right? That's happening. So the folks decide we need to build a park. So the creation of Central Park comes of the idea, the city is expanding, it's growing. The powers that be decide they're going to build a park, and it's going to be a grand park. They use what's called eminent domain. Are you guys familiar with that term? Who can describe that? What does it mean?
Government can condemn private property and seize it for public good.
So, but in the process of doing that, what happens?
You don't get paid for it.
They don't you get paid, but to achieve that, they describe a place as blighted, as poor. So, what happens to property value when you do that? So, this project is a project that involves historical archaeology. And when we think of historical archaeology, what are some of the things that come to mind in terms of what tools do archaeologists use to learn about the past? Right? Okay, what else? So we say historical documents. Maps, what else? Court records. We tend with primary source. When we say primary source documents, census records, newspaper articles. So what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to have you get your hands dirty, not with soil, but some documents. So I'm going to pass out some documents, and I'm going to have you browse through it quickly, and then we're going to come back together and have a discussion about these documents. Sounds like a plan?
Yes.
You guys excited to get
Yes.
busy? Okay, good. So I'll give you 5 minutes to just look at the document quickly. Then we're going to come back and discuss what document you are working with. Sounds like a plan? Okay. So once you look at this, we'll give you some background about Seneca Village. So in the 1820s, New York City changes its voting laws. For an African American to vote, you needed to own property valued at $250, be a resident of the city for at least 3 years. At the same time, these provisions were added to the requirement for African American males to vote. The requirement for white males was reduced. Why? New York City is about to emancipate folks who are enslaved. So in order to limit the power of the black males and disenfranchise that population, this was introduced. We believe that is an impetus for the creation of Seneca Village. Why? The initial purchasers buy property but don't initially actually live there, but it empowers them and gives them the ability to vote. So Andrew Williams is one of the first people to purchase property in Seneca Village, in addition to the AME Zion Church for its creation of a cemetery. By the time the settlement is about to be raised, there were 3 churches, 2 African American churches, and 1 mixed congregation. So there's the African Union Church, there's the AME Zion Church, and the All Angels Church, which was a mixed congregation of both white and black. The city takes over the property. In addition to that, there was College School number 3, located in the AME Zion Church. The city decides to go to build Central Park through eminent domain, but that wasn't the original area that the park was going to be built. Anybody has any idea where the park was going to be built prior? Anybody heard of Jones's Woods? So it was an area on the east side, close to the East River.
Which was?
Jones's Woods. Jones's. Yes. So the city uses eminent domain to take over the property. But guess what? The owners are wealthy, they're white. So they go to court and the city is not able to purchase that property. So the city swings around. There's a smear campaign that denigrates inhabitants in that area. What do you call them? So there's a group that looked at the newspaper from the New York Times, May 28, 1856. What group looked at that newspaper? Anybody read that? So I'll just read for you. You guys read this, right? You want to read what's highlighted in yellow? And read aloud also what can hear. Did you read it? Anyone? Yes.
West of the reservoir, within the limits of Central Park, lies a neat little settlement known as Inward Village. The Ebon inhabitants, after whom the village is called, present a pleasing contrast in their habits and the appearance of their dwellings to the Celtic occupants, in common with hogs and goats of the shanties in the lower part of the park. They have been notified to remove by the 1st of August. The policemen find it difficult to persuade them out of the idea which has possessed their simple minds that the sole object of the authorities in making the park is to procure their expulsion from the homes which they occupy. It is to be hoped that their removal will be effected with as much gentleness as possible.
Thank you.
Wow.
You're a New Yorker, you read this article in the New York Times. We have any compassion for the folks living in that community? It continues. So I read, if some of the hogs and goats and other inmates of the shanties in this vicinity do not die of the yellow fever this summer, it is only because Death himself hesitates to enter such dirty hovels. They don't say inmates. So, are these people inmates? You're a community, you're an inmate. But what is that doing? It's othering the community, denigrating. So you create an image. So when you sweep over to take over the property, what sort of resistance are you going to get from the rest of the society? But that's just one image of them. Here's another image of that same community. What group read the Lane of the Cornerstone? Any group that got the Lane of the Cornerstone? I just read for you quickly. That's from the New York Daily Tribune, August 5, 1853. Lane of the Cornerstone. The cornerstone of the first African-American Episcopal Church of Yorkville, and that's Seneca Village. Between 7th and 8th Avenue, the sermon on occasion was preached by the Reverend Christopher Rush, superintendent of African churches, who also laid the cornerstone. His text was part of the 6th verse of the 1st chapter of the 1st epistle of Peter. The box which was deposited in the cornerstone contained a copy of the Bible, a copy of the hymn book of the African Episcopal Zion Church in America, a copy of the discipline of the same church, a letter with the names of the 5 trustees of this church, and a copy of the Tribune and one of the Sun. The building will be 22 by 40 in size, will be built of wood and painted white. The basement will be a schoolroom for the education of college children. Towards 50 college families reside in the neighborhood of this church. There are 30 members in this society, and the congregation usually numbers about 100 persons. Circuit preachers from the African Methodist Church will supply the pulpit. So, see the contrast between what was written prior in trying to denigrate the community, but here's another image of the community. So you see, when you delve into documentation, you question what you read, but you don't rely on one source. You rely on several sources. So, with all this fanfare, the city takes over the property through eminent domain, but the owners have recourse to question what's given to them. So here's an example of one of the original owners, Andrew Williams. He goes to court to question what was given to him and the valuation of his property. So he is offered X amount and he says, I want more than what has been offered to me. But he brings a case in that what he says, Andrew Williams, the owner of lots 22, 23, and 43 in block number 786 on the Commissioner's map lying between 85th Street and 8th Avenue, objects to the report of the Commissioners on the grounds by the Commissioners have not allowed Sir Williams a sufficient sum for the aforementioned lots, they having allowed him the sum of $2,345 when Williams declared said lot with house at $4,000. Is it worth $4,000 or he's trying to build a case? Everybody notice the X above his name? What might that indicate? So he might not be literate, but that doesn't mean that he is limited in what he understands and what case he's going to bring. So he gets representation. So even though he might be illiterate, he was able to own property that's valued at X, but then gets devalued because it's considered blighted, but he's fighting his case. So think of other instances where eminent domain comes into play, populations and communities get displaced. So here in Seneca village, eminent domain comes into play, an entire community which existed for over 30 years in one area. And when I say community, there's a network and a weaving of interrelationships between people in that community. So this is a community away from city central. So when I say New York City was just initially south of 14th Street. So that is all the way uptown, but the city is moving and expanding because population is growing exponentially. You see the figures I showed you initially. And that's having an impact on growth of New York City. Yes?
The population growth, is that for births or immigration or migration?
So majority would be immigration. So if you look at a lot of folks coming from Europe, there's instability in Europe, and you notice the Irish put in a famine in the 1840s. That's a significant number. There's instability. We don't consider the population coming from Germany also. So a lot of folks coming from Germany. If you look at the census records, a lot of folks were from Germany. But because of First and Second World War, we think of folks who might have been of German ancestry, not highlighting that aspect of their ancestry compared to folks who might have been Irish or Italian. So, again, the census records looking at who comes from where, different populations, and you notice again in the census records, what's indicated if somebody is white is not indicated, whereas if somebody is of an ethnicity colored is indicated. And that's a way of othering also. If you're a certain population, then there's no need to identify who you are, right? Whereas if you are what is considered a minority population, a description has to be given. So again, some of you look at the church records for the All Angels Church. Now, because of fires and other issues, the records from some of the other churches is not high, it's not in abundance as what we had from the All Angels Church. So if you notice, I just pick up one example. And again, in the church records, what sort of information might you get from a church record? Okay, and what else? Pardon? Marriage, what else?
Yeah.
Baptism. Pardon? Size of family.
Tithe and offering.
Okay. When you die, what's going to happen? So the burials also, right? So here we have, I'll give you one example, October 21st, baptized at your home on 84th Street. Eleanor, born October 18th, 1849, daughter of John Castleton and Mary Kelly, his wife. Then sponsors. Then again, we go various stillborn daughter, a female stillborn child of Egbert Steers, Colin, and Catherine Cochran, his wife, White, was buried in All Angels Church graveyard, November 18th, 1849. To get an idea of, if you look at the sponsors, you can look at the maps and see is there a correlation between a sponsor, where sponsors live, might be a neighbor, might be another part of the community. What we noticed with Seneca Village is the core was African American and the periphery of a settlement, that's where folks who are Irish settled later on because they came at a later point. Okay. Maps are a good indication of the layout of the land. So if this is the Central Park condemnation map drawn in 1856. So if you take a look at it, what are some of the things that stand out for you? And what sort of information might you get from a map?
Ownership, land ownership,
Land ownership. What else?
demographics,
Okay.
Density.
Land density. So if you look at, now, this is one place. So this map is a series of maps that goes from 59th Street all the way up to 110. The city developed a grid pattern because as it moved northwards, the city, this commission decided that we will lay out a grid pattern to develop New York City. So the avenues will run from north to south, and the streets will run from east to west. And anything in this path would get bulldozed and leveled so the city can have a grid pattern. So if you look at Lower Manhattan, if you are not familiar, you can get lost easily down in Lower Manhattan. Whereas from 14th Street, you walk up, you walk east-west, you can know whether you walk in sunset or sunrise, and you take your bearings from here. If you get lost, then I'll have to get your compass. But lower down is different, right? So that was in 1814s, but was the roads and streets actually built up in Seneca Village at that time? No. But guess what? The land was laid out. The surveyors came and laid out the markers as to where the streets and avenues would run. So people who own property in that area, if you notice, New York City is in lots and blocks, so if you are between X and Y, you are between that block and you have a lot. If you have brownstones or buildings in Manhattan. So similarly, if you look at the layout of this map, you can see, you can determine ownership based on who is in what lot and who is in what block. Does it make sense? Now, when they build their homes, they make sure they did not build it in what might presumably become an avenue or street. And from that map, you can get the name of the owner, the dimension of the property, of the house, whether it was built, whether it's a frame house. Some are described as shanties, but that you question also depending upon who is describing the building. Again, another section of the map. Anybody looked at the New York Times this weekend? There's an article related to Seneca Village in the New York Times, and they made mention to Elizabeth Gloucester. So there were several owners in Seneca Village who were women. So here's one, and initially the city is going to give the funding for the sale of property to her husband, but she decides it's my property. So she argues that, and there's a difference in what she paid for the property initially to what she got because of inflation. So she initially bought it for $100, she gets $400, but is that the actual value of the property at that time? And I leave that to you to answer. I'm going to give you all the answers. You have to think, you have to start thinking also, right? So, it's an example of the All Angels Church. Now, remember I told you there were markers? So this is one of the markers laying out where the avenue and street would be if you continued in Central Park. So, when you go on a picnic, I know it's cold right now for most of you, but summer, spring is coming. These are some of the things you can look for when you go through Central Park. There are historical markers where, like this one, some are stone markers where the soil is softer. So we go back to this. From the information I've given you and the information you have looked at, if you were to read this article again, would you look at it and answer it differently? Yes.
First of all, I mean, I'm wondering whether we shouldn't be a little skeptical, because I work in a similar, I work in this time. New York Herald would be notoriously racist. The editor was an Irish immigrant who was notoriously racist. The New York Tribune, which the piece you gave us here, of course, is the most quote-unquote liberal, Horace Greeley. And I'm just wondering whether we can even trust that last one. Is that do you trust it? I'm suspicious.
But guess what? What year is the article? 1871? When was Seneca Village raised? 1856? What's the time difference? Is there any mention that there might have been a community in that area?
No.
No. How many churches were there in Seneca Village? How many churches?
3.
And what might be associated with a church? A burial ground, right? So right now, generally, you go to a cemetery that's far away from maybe a church, but in these days, if you look at churches, there's a burial ground right next to the church, right? So, finding burials in that area where churches existed should not surprise you, right? What about one burial being somebody who might be white and one might be black? Because we think of New York City as not segregated, but remember they was called school number 3, so it's segregated. Remember, in the context of that period, think of what life was like for African Americans. What sort of employment was available to them? Think of the climate of the possibility that you might be free, but if you look at this is from 1839, the Anti-Slavery Almanac. A Northern freedman enslaved by Northern hands. November 20th, 1836, Sunday, Peter John Lee, a free colored man of Westchester County, New York, was kidnapped by Tobias Benoit, E.K. Wadi, John Leon, and Daniel D. Nash of New York, and hurried away from his wife and children into slavery. One went to shake hands with him, while the others were ready to use the gag and chain. See the Emancipator, March 16th and May 4th, 1837. So, when we think of race riots in New York, we think of the period of the Civil War, but prior to that, the climate for African Americans is not the best. Think of the riots in 1834. Think of what sort of employment opportunities and living conditions are available for people who are African American. Why did this community decide to set up camp away from the city center, away from that cauldron where the population, remember I showed you the population growth and the percentage where African Americans remaining the same. Think of the climate, if you're somebody who's African American, living in a city that's changing, where your numbers were more or less on par, but right now you are less and less. So setting up a community in that area, away from the ice and the fear that might come from disempowerment. It's questionable also that might have been an area for the Underground Rail. It's possible, there's no definite, but it's just something we can question and consider. Is there a possibility? It's away from the city center, and you can operate in a clandestine way away from what's happening downtown. New York City grew up as a port city. With the expansion of the Erie Canal, that led to the growth. That's one of the things that led to the growth of New York City. Because New York City and Philadelphia are more or less on par, but with the opening of the Erie Canal, New York City explodes because it opens up the interior of the country, and New York City grows as a port city. And all that comes with it. We always one of the stops that Frederick Douglass came to on his way north. He stopped in New York, right?
Yes.
But he describes New York and the climate in New York also. So when we think of New York in one way, we have to encompass and think of the complexity of the city. Who was funding the enslavement program down south? Who are the financiers? So, again, also, what was the climate for folks who are Irish coming into the city? Because there's a racialization process that takes place when Irish first come to New York, or first come to the US. They are othered also. Why? They are Catholic, they speak Gaelic, which is not what's spoken by Anglo-Americans. Their religion, it seems, as they're Christian, but their religion is different. It says, the Ebony inhabitants of the homely village is called, present a pleasant contrast in their habits and appearance of their dwellings to the Celtic occupants, in common with hogs and goats of the shanties. So when they say in common with hogs and goats, you get an idea that they're living together with the animals. So that's all an attempt to put them in the same category, and a whole process of dehumanization. So think of what that does to a community, to a group of people. So the city decides it's going to build, and it builds a place that you all enjoy right now. I'm not telling you, I'm not critical of its use of Central Park, but what I ask you to do is consider the past. Consider a silencing of a community. Consider your own power in understanding that past. Your own power in spreading the message to others. Your own power in enlightening yourself to that knowledge. What tools can you use to understand that past? What tools can you use to question the past and the way it's presented to you? What can you do to commemorate that past? So it's not erased anymore. It's visible to not only you, but those who come after you. Don't look at me silent, don't look at me because you have what to do, right? Yes. Yes.
One point that we should take from this is the use of the way in which they generate the living conditions. They're using it now. Every
So-
time a building or a neighborhood gets, before gentrification comes, they're talking about the condition of the building.
So how many of you are familiar with Manhattanville? So when I say Manhattanville, you know what I mean? It's Harlem, but then it was Manhattanville at one point, but it became Harlem, and it was Harlem forever, but then Columbia's expansion northwards. So anyone using #1 train going to City College? I know you're downtown campus, but sometimes you can visit the campus uptown, right? So if you're on the train, when you get to 125th, before you get to 127, look towards the Hudson and you see that expansion. And there's a whole history to the shifting of the name from Harlem to Manhattanville, and how the community was described as blighted, and there's a resistance, but we see what's happening in the end. How many of you are Nets fans? Not many. No. Okay, come on. So we see what happened in Brooklyn, right? Again, the area described as blighted. Some people resist for a long time, and eventually. No, there's one thing with eminent domain being used by the city and government. There's another level when private developers, along with the city, comes over and takes over private property. Calls it and describe it in negative terms, and then it gets swept away. And when the folks get displaced, where do they go to? So, Seneca Village, if you're a homeowner, you got something, not the market value. But if you're a renter, what did you get? You're gone. And where do you move to? Or do you re-establish your community when you can't afford to live where you can because of the economics of the time? Because what happens to the property around the park after the park is built? And who owns that property? So, the same people who displace the folks who live in Seneca Village and the rest of the area of Seneca Village, they're the ones who own the property around the park, right? So they're the ones who benefit from that development. Whereas the people who own the property and get displaced can no longer live there. So they have to move somewhere much further. And that happens. So the information I'm giving you is not only from me, it's from a group called the Institute for Exploration of Seneca Village. Directors were Diana Wall, Nan Rothschild, Cynthia Copeland, and myself, and along with an advisory board. So, how we get started? Cynthia Copeland had an exhibit in the New York Historical Society, and that came from a book published by Roy Wesentwig and Elizabeth Blackmore in 1992 called The Park and the People. And in that book, there's a chapter on Seneca Village. So from that reading, Cynthia Copeland and Grady Turner curated an exhibit. But part of it was educational also. So they worked with high school students. So some of the work you're looking at right now, these are some work that they did with students. To use primary source documents to get them engaged with history, with real history, rather than lecturing and telling you this is a history. We empower our youth to know how history is created, how history is documented, who writes that history, and what perspectives they come with. Who asks the questions? What questions they ask? If it doesn't look like you and me or a multitude of people, then there's going to be a lot more bias. But if you're working for a community of learners where there are various experiences and ideas to explore, you get something that's rich. So that's the idea. And so, again, looking at historical documents, then we digitize that information. And if you notice, where there were property owners, we already had over the actual area. So before we actually went to the field to do test cuts, we did some soil corings, core samples, and always working with young people. Because they're the future, and not that they have to get involved or become archaeologists in the end, but they see the process and understand the power of giving voice to communities using material culture. You can't just go to the park and dig, you need permission. So, if we don't have right documentation, I might not be here right now. So, before we actually dig, there's something called a ground penetrating radar, and what it does, it sends a signal below the ground surface, and you get a reading. It doesn't tell you what actually is there, it tells you there's an anomaly. So to ground truth it, you have to actually do a dig. Here we do the mapping, because before you actually start digging, you have to lay out where you're going to put your test cuts. Here the students are opening, that's from our exhibition in 2011. Screening. When you dig, you do archaeology. Archaeology is disruptive, it destroys. So you have to take careful reading and measurements and drawings of what you do. The context is important. There's layering. So if something's on top, is it earlier or later than something below?
Much later.
Later, because what is below is deposited first, right? And if you look at the soil, you can see the different layers of when things were deposited. Now, because we worked in Central Park at the weekends, we had to backfill, because Central Park is heavily used, so we had to backfill and then fence stuff. And when we come back on the Mondays, we would remove that top layer. Here, students at the lab, mending, cleaning, and entering information and data. So this shows you an image of a wall, a stone wall. And that's just a couple inches below the ground surface. That is the stone wall for the sexton from the All Angels Church. So imagine you walk through Central Park and right below your feet, there's that history. Now, there are burials still in that area, but out of respect for the dead and the descendant community, we decided not to work in areas where there are burials. Okay. Show you some of the artifacts, so kids' shoes, ceramic glass, bone toothbrush. This is a layout of this structure was actually a three-story structure, a wood frame structure. This was the layout. And that building belonged to the Wilson family. Again, this is the students and directors at Herbert Field School.
I'm sorry,
But
what school was it?
that's a field school. It was a project between City College, Columbia University, and the New York Historical Society. And we selected students from New York City schools. You look like you're eager to ask some questions. Any questions? Oh, yes.
A question about the document that's a census record.
Yes.
The Westler, mother and daughter. His occupation says chair clock. For both of them. She's a little older at 40-something, his daughter's 16. Chair clock, what is that? I can figure out almost all the other ones. What's that job?
Top of my head, I can't tell you right now. Let me double check. Let me double check. Yeah.
It's a woman's job.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll look it up.
Okay.
Yes.
I live on the west side of
Okay.
right? I play basketball in second.
Okay.
There's a group that does a celebration, a commemoration. You must know about it every year. I can't think of the name, but every year they have entertainment and very important.
So there's some plaques right now giving some outline of a community, but we want more than this. There's different technology available right now where if you have a smartphone, if you walk, you should be able to get maybe information about the different descendants, people who live in the community. So that's things that we're working on exploring so that it empowers you to learn and know more about the community. Yes?
I heard about Seneca Village for the first time watching this television show called Comm about a year ago.
Only a year ago.
When was this story unearthed? When was it discovered?
So, historians and folks knowledgeable about New York City knew about it. However, in terms of the popular sector and public, it came with the book, The Pack and the Paper, where there's a chapter. And since then, from that chapter, there was an exhibit, and then we have been doing educational programs, going through libraries and schools, working with teachers to inform them about that history so that they can bring it to their students. So it's over 20 years right now. But there's a lot more to be done. since you only knew about it a year ago, and you're somebody who's knowledgeable and who is informed. So
I had to come back to college to hear about it.
Okay.
But what's your end goal? What's your overall vision for this? What do you like? What would y'all like to achieve ultimately?
One is site commemorated in a larger way. Though it's difficult to do that in Central Park. There's landmark status, Central Park has landmark status, but there are ways we can work around that. What we'd like also is that this history is part of New York City school curriculum. So things like Seneca Village and African burial ground, there should be more weaving of that history in students' understanding of that historical past.
I just want to say that it's funny that you said it's a year. I wanted to add, I learned it from an alternative high school.
Okay.
So, like, I was in a regular high school at first, and they talked about normal history and, you know, the ones that you see in the textbook. It wasn't until I got to an alternative high school that my history teacher talked mostly about that type of history. Seneca Village, and what happened in New York City during the riots, and even the Bronx riots of how Bronx got burned down and all that type of stuff. And it was very interesting to witness both sides of the history book, like where they hidden certain things in regular high schools opposed to an alternative high school where they have more of the freedom to teach you more.
What high school did you go to?
First, I went to Stevenson High School. It had 8 different high schools.
Okay.
So it was an arts high school, and that's the one that taught me regular history. And then I went to Arturo Skomberg Satellite Academy, and I finished my high school. And it was a beautiful experience because they taught me so much more about history. Yeah.
And that tells you also, always question what's given to you. Don't limit yourself to what's given in the classroom. Go out there and question, empower yourself with knowledge. I'm giving you something right now, but there's more to it than what I'm giving you. I have to think of, okay, I have so much time, what can I give you within that time? So, I've showed you a way of how you can learn that past. Don't stop that, don't make it stop right now. You've gotten some tools to go out there and continue that process. So I'm just wetting your feet right now. Empowering you to go there and continue that process. So, the archives are not too far away from here, right? Anybody here know where the New York City archives is located? Right across from the Department of Education, right? Chapel Street. Your local libraries might have something, your local historic. So most of what we have with the primary source documents will be New York City Archives, which is right on Chambers Street. There's the New York Historical Society, there's Schomburg. So don't limit yourself to just clicking IG and getting fun looking at somebody's YouTube. Go out there and create your content also. Go and build your research and spread that knowledge, spread the information. You have the power to do it. But to do it, you have to first do your research and form community with those around you so that you empower each other. You have a certain perspective. Somebody told you maybe question, why are you looking at it this way? And you, okay, wait a minute. I don't see it this way. You have a conversation. So you build community with each other, go out there and get the work done. Yes?
Oh, I just wanted to say that I'm almost the youngest person here, and as identifying myself as a black male, I understand black history, and even when there's also something else that I don't know about, I get to it and I learn more information about it. So that's how, I understand black history, also from my parents.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're lucky to have the influence of your parents.
Yes.
Yeah.
Grateful.
Yes.
Mr. Seignoret, does your institute have conversation and correspondence, their collaboration with the African burial ground just behind City Hall and the Harlem African burial ground that is currently under the decommissioned bus stop? Are you three groups doing call and response back and forth?
So there's some members of the board who are working with a Harlem African, and I not closely. There's also the Flatbush burial ground. So the number of other places that we work with and consult. It's a common history, and you see the networks, and you to understand that past. It's not you can't work in isolation. Because what's happening in New York City, you look at see what are the repercussions taking place in Brooklyn before Brooklyn becomes part of New York City. Because it's a separate village, a separate city until the turn of the 20th century.
You know, it's so interesting when we tell people where we live, if we say, we live on 110 between Columbus and Amsterdam, I say, we live in Harlem. They go, you don't live in Harlem. And I say, oh, we do live in Harlem. No, that's so far. We wear the Columbia University touches. But in our community, there is a large number of Blacks and Latinos. And it's like if you're on Amsterdam, hola, ¿cómo está? You know, when you go to Broadway, hello, how are you? And I love that, but we don't talk about history. And so my question to you is, what made this become a passion for you? Like, how did it happen? Because I have various passions, we all have various passions that have us do research, but where did your passion, where did it come from?
Actually, just up the hill, just up the road. So I came here to study architecture many moons ago. I'm going to say how long. And at a point where I came to study architecture because I wanted to design low-income housing that was this aesthetically pleasing. If you can tell, I'm from the Caribbean, from an island from Dominica. And actually, prior to coming here, my friend and I would travel. We lived in Dominica. My friend was actually from Trinidad, and we would island hop in summer to photograph different buildings. So we'll walk way up to St. Kitts, where my good friend is from. Work our way down, go to Antigua, Guadeloupe, then go down south, St. Lucia, Trinidad, and photograph buildings and look at the different aesthetics of the buildings to see how we can incorporate that in architecture. But also, was doing that, a lot of all the buildings we looked at were historic buildings. So when I came to study architecture, history was always close to me. One of my neighbors was a Garveyite, so I always got books from him. So questioning what history he gave us, because I grew up at a time when the Caribbean my island was just becoming independent. So following the change of colonialism, I frequented a bookstore. It was a bookstore called the Frontline Bookstore. So it tells you it's a models of revolutionary bookstore. So that's my brain. Then I came here studying architecture, was doing architecture, took a class, an elective, that was an urban anthropology class. And I said, oh, that's interesting because that wasn't my idea. And then right around the time, I decided to take another class in historical archaeology. At the same time, the African burial ground was discovered. So the person who was my professor in historical archaeology was the only historical archaeology in CUNY at the time and was a consultant on the project. So when she would come, I would come down to the talks and lectures and I'm like, wait a minute, there's that history here that nobody knows about. That how can you give a voice to a community, to a population that's not properly documented. And so I saw the power of using material culture to tell that story. So you can use archaeology, looking at what people use to talk about that past, and question the documentation and how the documentation is created. So you work with documents, you question it, you look at the material culture, you question it in terms of what was described and how it might have been used in the past also. Because depending upon how it's used, it might be different. Yes?
Speaking of material culture, we didn't spend too much time on the actual ceramics
Yes.
and tangible items within the household. But I think, obviously, we know that these weren't actually shanty towns like they were described. But I think for the larger population, it's just an indication of how much they were flourishing, right, within Seneca Village. Because they had these ceramics, they had porcelain and all these things, right? So they were really building generational wealth, and that was stripped away.
And that's stripped away. Yes. So, generational wealth in the US, how was it created initially? A lot of it is through land ownership, property ownership.
Yes.
Passed down to generations. And when you have a community when that is removed, and removed again and again and again, you see the issues of income inequality expanding, going one way, not coming this way, but going this way.
And it wasn't the enslavement of black folks that helped to give them that generation.
But not everybody recognizes this. So, to get an idea of who's here, what do you study at the Center of Work Education? Folks who are from CWE, yes.
No, I don't, my son went to Central Parking Secondary School, and he was part of that success. And he was, and I live downtown. I live 5 blocks away from the African American ground. So they were there when the conversation was around the African American ground. And I did not connect the two until I started working with Displacement in my community. And I could get people excited about empowering themselves around the history, because, you know, they don't see themselves as owners. But there's a lot of history down there, and that's how I circled back through learning the history of the people that lived there, who were also powerful. Oh my goodness. They own, not only did they own property, they owned businesses. But some of the people that was in Seneca Village, they were people that were doing runs for the Underground Railroad, we inspired that, all of that was part of the Underground Railroad, so they were very, very powerful people. We don't know anything, you know, we don't.
To make these connections. How many of you know of Wicksville? What about Sandy Ground? So Sandy Ground is another African American community that existed in Staten Island. Most of them coming from Virginia, South, the Carolinas, as oystermen, and establishing a community in Staten Island. And there's still there's a historical society in Staten Island. So there are all these little communities, there's all this history. That is American history. So we might want to separate, but that's the history of this country.
Yes. I don't want to keep talking, but I was a student here, now I'm teaching here, but when I was a student, Professor Dr. Barbara Omalade, and she's one of the reasons why I pursued the PhD, because she looked like me. And I didn't find too many professors who looked like me. And she took us to the African burial ground, and she took us to Seneca Village. And that was over 25 years ago. And I just remember the impact and just what she taught us as not just black students, but all students. And it was something that was not being taught, and she took us out of the building. And that's where I learned about And then when I told my mother, she was like, you knew, I told you when you were 3. But I'm just saying, just a testament to CWE and the professors and what the legacy that they left for us, the students, to also carry on that legacy.
That's something we can build on.
Yeah.
So, I know it's getting late and folks might want to get home.
No!
They have a class, I think that's the majority.
Part 2.
Okay, okay.
Part 2.
I asked you.
Thank you very much.